Hey team, and welcome to another entry in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. In this video, we're going to talk about magical electional opportunities that are available to us between the Cancer full moon on January 11th and until the Aquarius New Moon on January 24th. So of course, the Cancer full moon, this lunation is going to be a lunar eclipse. So because of that, we're going to have our typical rule about eclipse magic in full effect. Don't you do it. It's always important to remember to refrain from doing any sort of magic that is focused on growth or gain or anything like that during an eclipse because of the malevolent eclipse energies that are woven into anything that happens around that time. Now, I know a lot of contemporary New Age practices like to emphasize lunar eclipses as being like supercharged full moons, but they're not that. And there's a common practice also of charging crystals under full moon light, and I definitely don't recommend doing that during a lunar eclipse, especially if the lunar eclipse is visible at your location. Thankfully, after this, we won't really have to worry about eclipses for another 6 months, so after this, we're done for a while. But in today's video for this 2-week period, since we are dealing with a waning moon, unfortunately, I was only able to find 2 electional opportunities for us to talk about, and one of them is kind of more of an iffy, but we'll talk about that as well. But before we jump into the elections themselves, I wanted to take a second just to do kind of a quick catch-up with the planets, where they are, and how or how not we could use them in talismanic work. So, of course, the moon is going to go from her sign of Cancer to the sign of Aquarius, but because the node and the full moon occurs in the sign of Cancer, there's not going to be any opportunities for a moon in Cancer talisman during this time. Mercury is going to go from the sign of Capricorn to the sign of Aquarius during this 2-week period, and Aquarius, while being Mercury's nighttime triplicity, is not especially useful for a talisman, so we're still going to miss that. At the same time, Mercury's still going to be very close to the Sun during this, which makes him even less ideal for talismanic workings. In something of a classic case of good news, bad news, the planet Venus is going to ingress into the sign of Pisces, her exaltation from Aquarius during this 2-week period. And while you might be thinking to yourself, aha, here's a good time for Venus work and for Venus talismans, it's actually not, because while Venus moves into Pisces, we have Mars, who is in Sagittarius, and basically throughout Venus's entire stay, throughout her sign of exaltation, she will be in a square with Mars. So we're going to take a step back away from Venus workings during this time and hope that when Venus moves into Taurus in a couple of months, we'll have more to work with there. The Sun will ingress into Aquarius from the sign of Capricorn, kind of following closely behind Mercury, but of course the sign treats the Sun very differently than it does Mercury. Here in Aquarius, the Sun is in detriment, so we can't do a lot with the Sun during this time. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn will all just kind of hang out in their current signs of Sagittarius in Mars's case and Capricorn in Jupiter and Saturn's case. Jupiter is going to be, of course, in fall in Capricorn, so we're not going to really focus on Jupiter for planetary work as much as we can. And also, Jupiter is conjoined the South Node, which is actually something that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then Saturn, even though he is in his domicile of Capricorn, Saturn is very close to the Sun and is going to be kind of inoperable for a lot of planetary workings outside of any sort of general Kazemi ritual that we might focus on, and we'll talk about that as well. So that's where all of our planets are for this time period. Nobody's really in any great shape to be used for talismanic election, so we're not going to have any planetary talismans during this time period, which is fine, but we do have a lunar mansion and a fixed star talisman to talk about. So let's go ahead and get into that. So our first electional opportunity that we're going to have for this 2-week period is going to be on January 13th for me in the middle of the night at 2:44 a.m. And this example is for a 12th Lunar Mansion talisman. And now the 12th Lunar Mansion is one that I kind of get to talk about a lot. There seems to be a lot of great opportunities available for it. And the 12th Lunar Mansion is just a really great waning moon phase talisman to utilize. Anytime we're using waning moons, especially with lunar mansions, we have to focus on those mansions that are going to help us give away, let go, and release things. And the 12th mansion is really good for that. So in this election, we have the moon here located in the 12th mansion on the midheaven, always something that we want. And the moon's next aspect is going to be in opposition to Venus here. So you know how I am when I do a lot of these more, kind of negative, kind of more darkly aspected lunar mansions. I always try to have a benefic contact just to make it a little bit easier. So especially when we're talking about the 12th house, or the 12th mansion. I'm sorry, not the 12th house. Whenever we're talking about the 12th mansion and its focus on getting rid of something, like whether that be, it's supposed to be focused on getting rid of things that don't serve you, things that you kind of held on to for too long, either out of comfort or fear, and now it's just like, let's get rid of it. And this can be really great situation for that. The lord of the first house in this election is Mars here in Sagittarius, also in the first house, not poorly aspected by any other planet, kind of has this square with Venus kind of loosely applying. But otherwise is very well situated. So this can be a really great talisman to utilize to get rid of something, leave something behind you in 2019 to start off 2020 on the right foot. Though, as I've talked about before, using benefic planets in this way for these kinds of talismans can be something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can make the situation easier to navigate for the person who's having to initiate it. But on the other hand, the problem with benefic planets is that they try to stabilize things. And so a lot of times how benefic planets play out kind of poorly in relationships or with habits is that they kind of drag them out or just kind of like stretch them out much longer than they need to be. So that's kind of always something that you have to kind of weigh your options with. Is it something that you want to have an easier time with and maybe have to stretch out a little bit longer, like the whole entire process? Or, is it something that you would rather have like a quick and easy burn the bridge kind of process behind? Because for that, you might want to choose or wait for a different election opportunity that is a bit more forceful. But that's completely up to, your situation and what kind of your own personality or confrontation style is. Alrighty, so the next chart I wanted to talk about is this one here, not for a talismanic opportunity, but it is the chart for the Saturn Cazimi, and it's actually later that same day, January 13th, 9:16 a.m. Central Time, so whatever it is for you. The Sun and Saturn will be in an exact conjunction. And so Cazimi periods are not necessarily ones for talismanic creations. They can be, but they need like really kind of specific setups to be able to be viable. And you just don't really get them all that often because of what you have to have. But they are really great in like a ritual practice kind of context. So what a Cazimi is when a planet is within 16 minutes of the sun, not degrees, minute. And the Cazimi point represents sort of the union of the planet with the sun, who tends to represent like a deity or maybe the afterlife. In general. And immediately after the Cazimi, a planet is said to be reborn. It's sort of like the natural birth point of a planet. And so when we're working with this in a planetary magical practice, what it tends to be good for, what Cazimis are good for, is a time to set aside to kind of ritually cleanse and reset Saturn things. So if you have made any, Saturn talismans during the time that Saturn has been in Capricorn, the Cazimi is a great time to clean them and just sort of like reevaluate their effects and what they're doing and kind of re-strategize what you want from them. Or if you don't have Saturn talismans, you have like maybe Saturn sigils or Saturn altar, this is a really great time to clean it and just to kind of reset it and get things kind of set back up. You can basically think of Cazimis as planetary spring cleanings. It's just a really great way to put in sort of a more practical ritual use to a really important astronomical event for that planet. So the final chart we're going to talk about is going to be an election, a prospective election, we'll say, for the fixed star Antares, which happens on January 20th around 4 a.m. Central Time. So this is a chart that when I saw it, I was really very excited about it, and I want it to work. I really, really want it to work. So just to kind of go over everything really quickly, in this election, when we're talking about fixed stars, you of course want the fixed star to be on the angle. Antares is currently positioned at 10 degrees Sagittarius within the tropical zodiac, and here we have that star rising, with the moon applying a conjunction to that star's degree. And at the same time, Mars is also present on top of the star, and it's very exciting because Antares is of the nature of Mars. So having the planetary conjunction of Mars with the star Antares on top of the moon being there, grade A, perfect stuff. And the moon and Mars are unafflicted, so that's really good. But of course, anytime that we are talking about an election chart for a talisman, we're worried about the Lord of the First House and what it's doing. And this is where some of the apprehension comes from. So we have Sagittarius rising, which points us down here to Jupiter in Capricorn. And so, Capricorn is Jupiter's fall, which isn't great, but that's not terrible. I would like having low dignity is not necessarily a make or break kind of situation for Lord of the First House. We would prefer them to be well dignified and well placed, but really we're concerned about the kind of accidental misfortunes, being cadent, being retrograde, being combust, being afflicted by Saturn or Mars. Those tend to be much more immediate concerns. So we don't really have any of those here. There's kind of like this distant conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, but it's fine. It's like 11, 12 degrees apart, not a big worry. But what is the worry, what is the thing that's kind of got the attention here, is that Jupiter's conjoined the South Node. And this can be something that is a concern for people. And I kind of have gone back and forth about whether or not this election is actually good or viable. And so instead of just not talking about it or kind of talking it up, I wanted to take a second to talk about why that is and kind of the thoughts around that. The nodes in general kind of have difficult meanings and interpretations associated with them. They are the eclipse points between the sun and the moon, so they kind of carry that devouring, kind of flushing, sinking energy into them. So there are some schools of thought in the astrological tradition to where the north node is very benefic, and the south node is very malefic. And then there's another school of thought where the north node is sort of like a neutral increase, so with positive influences, the north node makes positive influences better and makes negative influences worse. The south node, on the other hand, is like a neutral decrease and makes positive chart placements worse by kind of toning them down, but also makes negative chart placements worse by also toning them down. So kind of no matter what school of thought you have or like you apply to this, it's probably not great that the Lord of the First House is conjoined the South Node. It's either, malefic contact or it's a diminishing contact, which isn't what you necessarily want. However, it actually seems more along the lines to where the nodes are much more of an affliction or more of an afflicting harmful presence to the sun and moon. And that would make a lot of sense because, the nodes are the points where the eclipses take place, and the eclipses involve the sun and the moon, the solar lunar eclipses. So planets like Jupiter don't necessarily get as heavily affected by the nodes as the sun and the moon do, which makes sense from a logical standpoint. They don't necessarily interact with the eclipse points in a meaningful, observable way, not nearly as meaningful or observable as the sun and the moon do. So all that to say that there is definitely some some reason or some cause to be, alarmed or confused or not want to use this chart, and that's totally fine. The unfortunate part is that our kind of other opportunity, when the moon is on the ascendant, we have Jupiter as Lord of the First House, who is conjoined the South Node, and our other option, I'll go and look at real quickly, is if we had the moon on the midheaven, then we could either have an Aquarius ascendant with Saturn as Lord of the First House, who is combust the sun in the 12th, can join the 12th house cusp, which we can't use that at all. It doesn't matter if Saturn is in Capricorn and domicile, we don't want that. Or our alternative is we could have a Pisces ascendant and be right back where we started. So that's great. That's what we want. You see the problem. So it's either we decide that the Jupiter with the South Node is not a problem, or, we don't use this at all, which is totally fine to do. And so one thing that I do kind of often if I find an election chart that I'm uncertain about or, kind of want a second opinion on, is I'll do a separate divination with the I Ching about it, whether or not I should move forward with it or kind of what I might expect with it. And so with this chart, when I consulted the I Ching, I initially pulled up number 60, restraint, with the number 2 line changing, which turned into initial difficulty number 3, which is exciting. But it was actually really interesting, reading through and kind of meditating on the imagery. So the first hexagram, restraint, its image is, of course, water over lake, and the kind of image associated with it is a river pouring into a lake. And so it's about restraint in that the lake will overflow if the river, puts too much water into it. And I thought that was really interesting imagery to be associated with Antares, which is a star that's associated with, anger, rage, courage, boldness. because if you don't restrain those emotions, they can cause you problems. So it was just kind of this interesting idea, let out enough of the Antares to be useful, but don't, overflow yourself with it. Which I thought was pretty interesting to consider for the Jupiter conjoined the South Node that we're kind of focused on, since it has more of a diminishing effect. So just that kind of initial imagery was really interesting, considering kind of the overwhelming nature of the fixed star Antares that we're dealing with. But the specific line that changed and the kind of imagery associated with that, the reading behind the line that changed was not going out of the gate into the courtyard brings misfortune. And sort of the general consensus of what that means is that by limiting yourself, you miss too many important opportunities. And this I kind of felt was like a personal jab at myself, that my kind of desire to make every election perfect renders me from being able to utilize all the elections that come my way. And this is something that I've struggled with a bit with, this platform and with this series of magical elections, because I've tried to focus on them being very beginner friendly, being, very low risk, just for people who are starting out or are otherwise, don't have the time to go through and, look at all the elections coming their way. So I definitely do think that it's true that there are a lot of, decent elections that have come since I started this series that I just haven't talked about because I dismissed them on, kind of minimal faults, and that's totally fine. But for this, I thought it was an interesting wake-up call that, probably this election is fine and dealing with the South Node Jupiter is that much of an issue. Now, the hexagram that they changed into initial difficulties was kind of interesting. The image for that is like thunderclouds before a storm, and that you have to go through the storm and then it clears up and everything's fine. So I wonder if that is, a fortune telling on what kind of damages or what kind of effects the talismans are going to have, to where it's going to start out kind of rough, but then it's fine, which isn't, necessarily uncharacteristic or unheard of with more aggressive Mars typed or Mars natured stars and talismans. So that might just be like a duh, this is what you're going to get because you're dealing with Mars type spirits. But it was very interesting to have this reading kind of laid out for me and reflect on what that means. So basically, I say all that just to give an idea of kind of what goes through my head, my thought processes, what other kind of tools I reach for when I'm unsure about whether an electional chart is good enough or not, or whether or not I should share it. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the person doing it to decide if they want to go forward with it, and whether or not they feel like the Lord of the First House being conjoined the South Node is bad enough to keep them from doing it. That's totally that call, and you can kind of come up with different rationales for one way or the other. It just depends on how seriously you take it. For myself, I probably will not move forward with making a talisman for this star, not because I'm unsure of the election itself, but because I'm actually kind of have all my resources tied up and focused on a different fixed star talisman that's coming up in February, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later so that you guys can have a heads up on it as well. But this election kind of jumped out at me relatively last second, so I don't really have the time to get everything together for it. So those are all the electional opportunities we have available to us, just those two, the 12th Lunar Mansion talisman and then the Antares fixed star potential talisman, if you chose to move forward with that. Don't forget about the Saturn Cazimi on the 13th, a really great time to reset and recharge and clean up any Saturn talismans you have or any kind of prolonged Saturn workings you have going on, a really great time to reassess that. I hope everybody had a happy and safe New Year's Eve and that your 2020 is off to a great start. Also, of course, a big thank you to all my patrons and all of your questions and comments on the Patreon. I really look forward to reading those and responding to those and carrying on those conversations with everybody and seeing what everybody's up to in their own magical practices. And, let me know if anybody has any experience with working with talismans where the Lord of the First House is conjoined the South Node that isn't also the Sun or the Moon. It would be really interesting to see kind of what happened with those talismans, because it's actually something that I don't think I've ever worked with before, not necessarily because I've actively avoided it. Oh, Lily Bean. Oh, here's Lily Bean. I want it up. But just because I don't think the opportunity has really presented itself to me before this Antares talisman has. So everybody take care, and I hope we all have an event-free Caner Lunar Eclipse, and I'll see everybody again on the Aquarius New Moon. Bye. Oh no. He says bye-bye. Bye.